So this is the last one. This is the last conversation we have for the weekend for Bookstock number one. This is going to be, it's a sense of time and place. And this one is going to be really interesting for a few reasons, and we're going to find that out. But partially because, as we've been saying throughout some of the conversations, we write about drinks, but it's not really writing about drinks. I mean, yeah, we're writing about drinks, but it's not just drinks. Anyway, we're going to delve into that over the next 45 minutes or so. And I think we have like a really cool couple of perspectives coming into it. We've got Amanda Schuster. Amanda is the editor-in-chief of The Alcohol Professor, alcoholprofessor.com, and the author of New York Cocktails. And we've got Phil Greene. Phil is a, I don't know, is a lawyer with a writing problem, writer with a lawyer problem.
It's like I'm David Embry or something.
Yeah. I'm not even going to.
Not quite as big a jerk.
I'm not going to go that way. Yeah. But no, Phil has 3 books. I've lost track. 3 books now.
3 books.
To Have and Have Another, which is still in the ranks of my favorite book titles.
It was in your top 11. Right?
Exactly. It was number 11. But then your most recent one is a drinkable feast, cocktail companion to 1920s Paris.
Right.
Correct?
Right.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to let you guys duel it out. But I guess, just to start off, because we're talking a sense of time and place, we're talking New York City, we're talking Paris. Are you sure you weren't playing it too cautious? Was there enough material to work with between New York City and Paris?
No, well said. Yeah, I think in the last panel they were talking about the expat community of Paris in the 1920s and talking about barflies and cocktails. That book, I probably couldn't have written my book without that book, because it gave you that sense of community in Paris 100 years ago, just about. Americans were happy to get out of America, but they wanted to be around other expats. And I think coming from that perspective, it made it easier to write about what it must have been like to live in that time as a young artist, a writer, a poet, a sculptor, a painter, in this amazing community teeming with other expats, be they from Spain or Italy or French, And my Manhattan book, trying to put myself back into New York City circa 1875, 1880, 1890s, when the craft bartenders that we were talking about earlier, the Harry Johnsons and the only William Schmidt, these people were rock stars of that era, and the glittering palaces like the Hoffman House. What must it have been like? So I think for both of us, it's a form of escapism. Woody Allen made the movie Midnight in Paris about a young guy who wants to be back there, and that was kind of my perspective in writing the book, to transplant yourself to another time and place. But and your beautiful book on Manhattan, New York.
So 2 years ago, almost to this day, somebody called me and said, "We want you to write a book about New York cocktails, all of them." And, unlike Phillip, I didn't have a specific time and place. I had just the place. And then all the time, except that I didn't have all the time, because the next shoe that dropped was, you only have 6 weeks to do this.
Oh my goodness.
And I had to really think about this. First of all, can I do that? And I also had to work full time, and I had to, here's a word we all like a lot, distill all of this information into a certain number of pages in that short amount of time, and obviously, call in a lot of favors to people who have, worked in the city, and be like, can't come to your bar right now. I've been there before. I'll see you in a few weeks. Can you just send me, this recipe and this time? But I couldn't call Harry Johnson. I couldn't call, Jerry Thomas. These were people, who I had to sort of like mine what I could in the short amount of time that I had, and figure out what about those things was the most important. And so I had to put together, times and places, and do kind of like a chronological thing, but then also talk about what it's like to get a drink in New York at Christmas time, and what it's like, on Memorial Day and in the summer, and where to go for that. So it was a very complicated task that you know, I hope I managed to do. There are a lot of things I'd love to change now, but you know, I got it together.
Right. So, I mean, as you start going through that, and Phil, the same way, as you're looking at a very specific kind of historical time and the things that are going on, part of this is about setting parameters for yourself so that you're not trying to exhaustively cover every single thing that happened and every single drink that was served during that, but finding what actually matters, what fits your purposes, what you're searching for, and what's a distraction. How do you draw those lines as you go?
Well, what was fun about my Manhattan book was I could focus on the presumed time that the drink was invented, you know, 1880 thereabouts, 1875, but I could also bring it forward and talk about the craft cocktail renaissance because of all the great drinks that were coming out of the different, or named after the boroughs of Brooklyn. So I called the chapter "The Sons of Brooklyn." So I was able to talk about Sasha, and he had just passed right before the book came out. But all of the people who worked for Audrey and, you know, all the great drinks, you know, the Red Hook, you know, Enzo, Enrico, and so it allowed me to sort of straddle different generations in talking about the very recent past or the dark, you know, way back before Prohibition. So it was a lot of fun. The Paris book, I kind of had to have that. I mean, I could talk about, well, Harry's New York Bar was actually started in 1911, but my focus was going to be in the decade of the 20s, so I had to really limit what I could. I had to sometimes borrow a little bit of Gatsby because it was published while he was in Paris, but it was, of course, takes place in Long Island, you know.
Right.
So you have a little bit of cheating.
Yeah, there's a little bit of license, but I mean, you have that opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really had to think about what's comfortable, what's a good place to get a drink, and what do I want to tell people about that place, you know, and what really makes that, what makes an enduring classic, and what do I want to put in a time capsule of 2017 that will tell people about New York City and what's going on and what informed that before, and that was the most important thing to me. That it be a comfortable book, that you read it comfortably, that it not be too technical, that, you know, my grandmother used a wonderful Yiddish word, that it not be too ungepatchked. You know, that was the idea. So.
Right. And so, I mean, you talked about you had this very kind of tight time window that you had to focus on this. And so you kind of approached it, well, I mean, that was setting a big parameter for yourself. I guess in terms of, like, you know, the kinds of content, the kinds of quality of the cocktails you're bringing into it, and also, I mean, with Phil, with your work, but I'm thinking particularly about the Manhattan book at this point. How are you, like, prioritizing the information for yourself and the things that you wanted to find out, the things that you wanted to present, and structure it that way?
First and foremost, you want to start off with, can you figure out who invented the Manhattan? Because you have the Jenny Jerome story, and you have these other stories. I even found a fake news story, a hoax article that was written probably by H.L. Mencken. So there was a lot of fun folklore in that. But what kind of surprised me in writing the book was that vermouth was this rock star ingredient in the 1880s, 90s, all the way up to Prohibition. And it's one of these, you know, like Horatio Alger, you know, maybe not Horatio Alger, but, you know, this immigrant that makes it big in the New World, you know. Nobody had ever heard of vermouth. It's invented in 1786 by Antonio Benedetto Carpano and starts coming over to the U.S. in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, and I guess it's being consumed in the Little Italies of the world. And then a bartender, you know, decides, probably in Manhattan, to put it in place of the sugar in an old-fashioned, and oh my goodness. So vermouth was this darling, this killer app, and it really opened my eyes to what a star it was. And then in the 20th century, people start whispering vermouth over their martinis, and it falls to 2-to-1 ratio or less in a Manhattan, and it's forgotten, you know. And then the craft cocktail renaissance brings it back again. So the cocktail era of the Gilded Age and the recent cocktail renaissance have made vermouth ascendant again, and that was sort of you know, an unsung hero of the book, I think. That it was a lot of fun to explore that.
Yeah. Amanda, what about you? I mean, as in terms of your structuring of this, in terms of your approaching it, how do you go about that?
I had to think about what the classics of New York were, what were cocktails that were truly born in New York, what had become the neoclassics, what's become part of the pantheon now, and how those things sprouted from one another. Obviously, there had to be a big section on the Manhattan, which I do think is the quintessential drink along with the martini of New York. I actually didn't want to go too far into martinis because I didn't want to start a whole thing. I'll let other people do that. But it was really important for me to have, and because almost every great cocktail bar of the past 2000s has had their own variation of the Manhattan, whether it be, representing the neighborhood where the bar happens to be, the Carroll Gardens or something, or just a fun way of playing around with the vermouths and amari and all kinds of stuff in there. So there's that, but then how other things evolve. It was really cool to talk to certain people about things like the pina colada, and why that's an important cocktail in New York, and to talk to Audrey about the Gin Mule, and to Dale about Irish coffees and things like that. I mean, there are all these things that you don't really think about are part of this whole New York fabric.
Right, exactly, and that's something I want to tease out a little bit more, because we're talking about things that are from New York or things that you found from bartenders in New York, and the same thing also for your work with Manhattan and Paris for that matter, where you're looking at things that are kind of a time and place, but using those to tell the story of that time and place.
Yeah.
How do you, what's going through your head as you're kind of tying all of this together for the things that you're looking for to make this kind of work toward that larger goal?
Yeah, one of the funny things that happened while I was writing the book, because it is New York, and because I only had 6 weeks, the Attaboy guys were in the process of opening Diamond Reef while I was writing the book. I couldn't actually talk to them because they were so busy working on that project, and I had to have the penicillin in there, and I only discovered maybe the day or two before I turned in the manuscript that they were going to be making this cocktail for Diamond Reef called the penicillin, a frozen version of it, which is an awesome drink, by the way. And so things like that were constantly happening, and it was a great thing. I loved it. I loved seeing the evolution of these drinks in the city, and the modern interpretations of them, and what people want to drink and what makes them comfortable when they go to the bar, and also the Instagram culture and the cocktail of the move. At the time it was Porch Light and the blue drink that they had there that was on everybody's Instagram feed.
Yeah. And Phil, both to that point, but also kind of more specifically for you, when you look at your Paris book, you're looking at a very specific time as well, but also a very specific kind of cultural moment.
Yeah, it was an era that anybody who was there wrote a memoir about it. So getting down to, okay, how am I going to write this book? I ended up with 3 different spreadsheets. So these are all the people, from Scott and Zelda to Ernest Hemingway to Ezra Pound. What did I have drink related about them? Okay, that's here. Then all the venues, from Harry's New York Bar to the Hotel Ritz to the Hotel Crillon to Café de la Paix to every different venue, Café du Dôme. What do I have to say about that? And then the drinks, so I'm looking at Harry's ABC, I'm looking at Barflies, I'm looking at the Ritz book, which didn't come out until 1936, but the Ritz bar opened in 1921, so I felt like I could get the bee's knees in there. And then you just start weaving, you say, well, I know all this about Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Don Dos Passos, and oh, they were drinking at this place, and these are drinks that are mentioned in their novels and short stories, and you just start weaving it all together. But having original source materials like Barflies, where you can learn more about this character named Sparrow, or as Jim Meehan pointed out earlier, the Boulevardier was a creation of a couple people who Erskine Gwynne, who was a publisher of a magazine called the Boulevardier. It wanted to be the New Yorker of Paris. It only lasted about 5 years. But, is it just a bourbon Negroni? Well, you could call it that, but it's got this really cool story behind it. So it was a lot of fun I felt like the Owen Wilson character. I'm constantly going back, and my wife is like, "Are you still in Paris?" I'm like, "No, I'm sorry, I'm here." So it was fun. It was my own time machine to go to Paris of 100 years ago,
right.
And it was fun to be able to tell the stories. With the Hemingway book as well, it was trying to put yourself back into Key West in the 1930s or Havana in the 1940s and 50s and try to follow the exploits of Ernest Hemingway through all the drinks that were in his novels and short stories and letters, and I even found one in his medical records of all places.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a lot of fun. He would write letters to his friends telling them how to make a Bloody Mary or how he made his martinis so cold by freezing the onions and making ice cubes in tennis ball cans to have these giant cubes of ice.
Right.
You know, he's a craft cocktail guy, and he gets maligned a lot because, you know, the Death in the Afternoon's an undrinkable drink. You know, well, okay, I don't put absinthe in my champagne either, but it's still a cool story.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to be able to go back in time into those places was a lot of fun while writing it, and I hope it's fun for people reading it. So.
Speaking of going back in time, it was important to me in the book to have a section of it that was an homage to places that were gone and never coming back, that we all miss, and you know, and you know, some of those places had only fairly recently closed, so I could speak to some of the people who were involved with them, and some of them. Yeah, but to be able to talk about like the Stork Club, you know, and the Oak Room and places like that, it was, you know, that's such an integral part of New York City drinking history that I'm so afraid is going to be kind of lost, you know, into the ashes. And as you know, I say the city builds over itself constantly. And places open up in those places. And you know, I was thinking just a couple weeks ago, I was invited to taste something at what had been the North Star, which was Gaz Regan's bar, you know, down by the seaport. And I told them, I was like, you know, this used to be the North Star. The what? You know, and that was 20 years ago already. And you know, these things are getting lost into time, and it's so easy to do that in cities that are evolving, and you know, as rents increase and owners change.
I think that's a really good point because, you know, we're talking sense of time and place, but obviously this is a time when so many cities are seeing these massive changes, whether it's New York City, my home city of Seattle, where you see, you know, restaurants disappearing, bars disappearing, just things changing on a massive kind of scale. So that when we have these kinds of snapshots of places, of the people who inhabit them, of the recipes that they're serving, of the kind of life that they have at the time, it's almost like this cultural seed bank, it feels like, you know, so that like we've been sitting here today in two separate sessions talking about Harry's New York Bar in Paris in the 1920s and the way that things like the Boulevardier and the book itself continue to influence what we're doing today. So it's that kind of thing where we're looking at what happened in 1930s Paris or in New York City 1990s with one eye possibly to New York City 2050, 2075.
Yeah.
You know, when people come back and say, there used to be a really cool bar in this block called Attaboy.
Yep.
This is what they did and this is how it came about.
Yep.
Is that part, you know, does that factor in any way when you're going through this thinking, you know, this is like an obligation in some ways to preserve this?
Absolutely. I mean, it was up to me. It was a Herculean task to really represent my city at that time, to discuss the things that had happened before, but you know, which bars do I really want to talk about that are happening now? And there were some places I was like, you know what, I'm going to put this in this book, and it's probably going to be gone in a while. And sure enough, it was. But I still felt like it was like, well, this is what we were doing. That this was something that was important at the time. This had to be there because this is what was happening. And you know, if somebody's reading the book in 20 years, they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. We kind of went through that phase with the blue drinks, didn't we?
Right.
So, you know, it's a thing. So you know.
We still have McSorley's and places like that.
Right, sure.
I was pleasantly surprised in the Paris book at how many of the places are still open. I mean, the Dingo is gone. It's now an Italian restaurant. That's where Hemingway met Fitzgerald for the first time in the spring of 1925. But right around the corner, Café du Dôme, Café Select, Café Rotan, and the La Coupole, they're all still there. Down at the end of Boulevard Montparnasse, you've got Closerie des Lilas. Harry's New York Bar is still there. The Ritz is still there, although the bars have swapped sides. The bar Hemingway at the time was a secondary bar, ladies only. It's called a sweatshop because it wasn't ventilated very well. Women would sit there and talk about their divorces or their soon-to-be divorces. But the main bar where the Hemingways and the Fitzgeralds were rubbing elbows, that's now sort of the secondary bar. So, but yeah, a lot of these places are still open. Hotel Crillon. The bar is in a different part of the hotel, but it is kind of cool to go back and see these places, and they're still there. Now they've been renovated and they look nothing like they did 100 years ago, but can't win them all.
Yeah.
You know?
It was funny, I was at the 21 Club with my parents a couple of weeks ago, actually just last week, just a week ago Friday. And my dad, who's recovering from hip surgery, it was a big deal to kind of get the family together and go someplace, New York, someplace really important. And I ordered a 50-50 martini, and he, like another Yiddish word, he nearly plotzed. He was like, what are you doing? Nobody gets that. And he was also surprised that it was made well. Right. Because the 21 Club was the place you couldn't get a great drink. Uh-huh. It was they were okay drinks. They were going to be fine, and it turns out that they've now elevated the bar program.
What the hell happened there? This place used to suck.
Right, now it's good. What's going on? Yeah. So that's happening a lot too, where a lot of the the older establishments are stepping up their game because they realize that they've got some pretty serious competition from the new and shiny things, and people have to remember
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Can we talk mechanics for a little bit? Because we've gone into this a little bit yesterday in terms of the research process and digging for source material, whether it's interviews or going down historical routes. I want to talk about that with you guys a little bit because again, you're going very much kind of sense of time and place and looking at very specific regions, but also, Phil, you had mentioned earlier kind of like taking these separate threads, these separate spreadsheets, and weaving it all together. We haven't really talked about that in any of the drinks writing sessions yet, especially because both of you guys have other things that you do in your lives during the day. What's the mechanics for taking that information, sorting it through, and then actually putting it together into something people can buy here?
I'm just glad I had more than 6 weeks. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. It's like 6 with like, oh my God.
6 months, but no, it's just, I told you my process. I use that same process for both the Hemingway and the Paris book. The Manhattan book was almost like I didn't know what I wanted. I knew some of what I wanted to say, but as I got into it and started discovering more folklore I didn't know was out there, like, oh, did you know they made Manhattans in a hot water bottle in Some Like It Hot? Oh, I didn't know that, and you tell that story. Right. Did you know that Teddy Roosevelt's vice president had a fall from grace because he served Manhattans at a luncheon when he was supposed to be a teetotaler? I didn't know that one either. The more you peel back the onion, the more you read archival newspapers about all these drinks that were coming from the Manhattan platform, you've realized, wow, there's more here than I thought. So that book sort of, again, took me by surprise. I didn't really know the structure of it until my elbows, I rolled up my sleeves. So, and it took me forever to figure out structurally. The Hemingway book was the first book I ever wrote, and I thought, okay, how am I doing this chronologically? These are drinks from Key West. These are drinks from Cuba. These are drinks from, no, that's not going to work because he drinks martinis everywhere. You know? Am I going by gin, by rum? And I finally said, no, idiot, just do it alphabetically. And within each drink, you're going to tell a story about The Sun Also Rises or Paris or Havana, and it sort of came together much more easily than it took me 6 months to figure out that very obvious way of writing it.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, part of it is kind of flailing about in the mud until you find that thread that like, oh God, why didn't I see that before?
Yeah. I was given a very precise structure by my publisher. It said, okay, you have to have a chapter about this, you have to have a chapter about this, this, and this, and this thing. And, I had agreed to write that book, but they also asked me to write this book. So my first action was fuck this noise. Yeah. I'm going to do this in sort of that structure, but I also have to put my own imprint on it. This has got my name on it. I'm not going to just I'm not going to write just a coffee table book and like, oh, that's nice. I'm going to make jokes. I'm going to insert my personality in this. I want this to sound like I'm sitting in the bar with you, having this drink with you, and this is what's happening here. And so I had to really think about that. What sounds like me and what doesn't sound like me. when I'm writing this, and what looks like this place, what do I want to say about this place, what do I want to convey about this mood, and what it sounds like, what it looks like, what, you know, how you feel when you leave it or when you walk in.
Right. And so once it's done, once you've got everything together and you're looking over all of your information, before you're sending it off, or maybe you're sending off piecemeal or you're begging for more time, when you're looking at it, at what point do you kind of assess the situation and say, this is what I was aiming for, I'm capturing the things I want or the things that I'm missing? At which point do you find yourself satisfied with it? Or do you? I'm never satisfied, but maybe you, I'm that person who's dissatisfied with everything, so maybe you have a different perspective.
I had sort of a painful lesson that I learned with the Hemingway book. I turned it in on time. I was very happy with it. And the lawyers at Penguin took a look at it and said, you're quoting a lot of Hemingway here. I think you're, and I'm an intellectual property attorney who has a fool for a client if he represents himself. But that's an old lawyer joke. But I'm thinking like, no, that's fair use. That's fair use. And besides, Simon and Schuster, no relation.
I know.
They're going to be very happy that I'm telling the world about Hemingway. It's going to help their book sales, you know. Okay, Phil.
Yeah.
So they said, we need to send this to Simon and Schuster. So I had to break down, okay, from The Sun Also Rises, I'm using 765 words, and here they are. From Islands of the Stream, I sent this lengthy document off to them, expecting them to come back and say, you need to pay us a royalty, and that's what they did. They wanted $22,000 from me. So I had to rewrite the whole manuscript, paraphrase wherever I could, sprinkle in quotes here and there.
Right.
It was not fun. It was not fun. And then you get to the point of, okay, you have all these great pictures from the JFK library, and they all say public domain on them, but the Penguin lawyers wanted an official signed document from all these different sources.
Right.
Well, we think it's public domain, we don't know. So then you have to investigate whether it's an orphan work or not, and then show the Penguin lawyers that, it sounds like a movie. Okay, this book of Hemingway, standing next to Charles Baker with a giant tuna, has been used in this book, and this book, and this book, and they didn't get sued. So if you could just convince the lawyers that these books, that these photos have been used so many times in other Hemingway books, we're okay. We're probably not going to get sued. No one's claiming ownership. Because if I say to you, can you take a picture of us, to memorialize this moment? You own copyright in that picture because you're the person holding the camera. Well, if someone took a picture of Hemingway sitting at a cafe with his second wife in Havana on his 35th birthday, which is in my book, who knows who took that picture? No one's going to come out of the woodwork, we hope, and file a lawsuit against me for not giving them attribution or royalties or something like that. So yeah, that's sort of this is not time and place related, but these are the things that sort of go into the writing
But it's
of a book.
documenting time and place related,
Yeah.
very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
Interesting.
To me, it felt like, you ever gone into a diner and been handed this gigantic menu and wonder how the hell they could possibly make all the things
It's exhausting.
that are on the menu? That's how I felt
Right.
about putting this book together, knowing that the city was my massive diner menu, and I had to only present of, however many thousand dishes, I only was able to present a couple hundred. So which ones would I want to order from New York? Was how I had to do it, and I. So many things. I still, it was 2 years ago, and I still every once in a while have in a night of insomnia. I'm like, why was that in there and not this in there? And why was it this cocktail and not that cocktail from this place? Why didn't I insist? No, I don't want the truffle infused thing. No one's gonna make that. But
I had the same sort of moment, and Robert, you'll appreciate this. About a year after my Manhattan book came out, I learned, I forget how, that in Wisconsin, they make Manhattans with brandy. It's like, I didn't know that. Damn it! I wish I'd known that.
Oh, wow.
Or in northern Michigan, it's always going to be on the rocks, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So, you're always going to find things that you wish you could have put in, and if it comes out in second edition, well, there you go.
Right.
But you do have those moments of regret after.
It's out there now. I have to live with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure we have some time for questions from you guys. This would be the time. Yeah.
Good segue, because you were just talking about the editions that come up. You use the word folklore, you use the word history and research, and how do you know when to stop? Because so there's always where did the Manhattan begin? Did it begin over here? Did it begin over there? Where did this thing start? Over there? Over there? Was it this guy's or that guy's? At some point, you have to pick one. How do you do that with whatever it is you're researching and whatever drink, whatever place, how it got
You have
started?
to
When do you
remember,
stop?
the girl that brought me to this dance is the story that my ancestor, Antoine Peychaud, invented the cocktail. Okay? And I'm the guy that pretty much blew up the...
You're that guy.
Yeah, well, I found out that he was born in 1803, and of course that's the first time you see, or 3 years later it's defined in print, 1806. I had a tour guide say to me in 2004, "You don't know how frightened we are of you, Phil, because I'm the guy that's ruining their story as they're taking people down Royal Street." We have to mix in a lot of according to legend because so much of this industry is folklore, and the bourbon stories you'll hear about Four Roses, they come up with a new story every few years about, if the girl would go out with him because she wore roses, come on. It's all great fun. The sealback cocktail.
Yeah.
So glad I don't have to drink one on this visit because we know that story's not true anymore. So I was a history major. I'm an attorney. I try to be precise and accurate, but there are times when, damn it, I want to tell the Dorothy Parker quote about Under My Host, even though she probably didn't say it, because it's too good not to use. So you just have to, look, I'm going to tell you the Jenny Jerome story. I'm going to tell you the Man Named Black on Broadway. I'm going to tell you the story about the duel fought in Bladensburg, Maryland, where the Manhattan was invented. Or the New Orleans restaurant owner who actually existed, who maybe invented the Manhattan in New Orleans. I'm going to tell them all to you, and I don't know which one is true, or there may be the fifth one that's actually the real answer. You have to mix in the stories with the facts and let the reader decide if he or she's engaged or entertained and draw their own conclusions, I think.
I think there's a reason that folklore and bullshit both have the same number of letters in them.
Well said.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Other questions? Thank you. Yes, up here.
Megan.
Terroir guy. He's going.
Me. Sorry. I got questions. You guys got answers. So I'm a native New Yorker, born and bred in Brooklyn. And New York City is a city that voraciously devours itself.
Yes.
Because of the value of the real estate, because it's an island surrounded by water, we can only go up. So all the square footage is impossibly valuable. Other cities that have tremendous folklore and cultural history for cocktails, like Paris or like London, they don't seem to be so devouring. They seem to have a lot more of a respect for their cultural history. Phillip, you mentioned all of the Parisian bars and cafes that are still around. Is there anything other than the value of real estate in New York that kills all of the history? Yeah. Like, do they just protect it more in Paris? Do they just protect it more in London? And why?
I think the hospitality industry is precarious, and I think restaurants close, bars closed, places are trendy and then they're not. Mm-hmm. What did Yogi Berra say about, no one goes there anymore, it's too crowded, People change their mind and go to new places. Thankfully, people are still going to McSorley's, and other places like that. But we just saw the Waldorf Astoria close their bar. It's like, how the hell did that happen on our watch,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's unique to New York. A lot of competition, maybe. Who knows?
I think people people maybe sometimes get too comfortable. There are a lot of places that have closed that it wasn't even a rent problem necessarily. It wasn't the sort of problems that we associate with real estate. It was just, it becomes a family thing too. Something that's happening actually in the neighborhood that I live in is you've got these establishments, they own the building, right? They can't blame it on the rent, but a certain generation started the business. The next generation isn't interested in carrying it on. They'll make more money if they rent the space out to some sort of franchise that that already exists, and nobody's ever in there. They wanted it to be the old pizza place. They wanted it to be the old red sauce joint, but it's not going to be there anymore because the kids didn't want to be bothered with it. And that happens a lot in New York too, and it's happening more and more where these great old establishments are closing for no other reason than lack of interest.
What are some other cities that could carry a cocktail book that people would want to read?
Well, a few have already been written about New Orleans. I
Yeah.
think certainly San Francisco. Maybe Melbourne, Australia is on the short list.
Boston.
Boston.
No
yeah,
one's done
absolutely.
Boston yet. Chicago.
Milan, yeah, Chicago. I should call my agent.
And,
That's
and
what,
listen,
that's what
I
everybody
think,
in this room just thought, Phil.
and I think there has to be one about Kentucky. And I think, and you know, somebody asked me the other day, why is repeal such a big deal in this city? And it's like, hello, you know, it completely decimated the entire economy of this state. And, you know, it's definitely worth discussing, you know, what the culture was like before and after.
Any other questions? Yeah, oh God.
Does a city have to have certain other characteristics in order to foster a rich drinking culture?
Ooh.
I would think yes. I used to think a city's going to be boring unless there's water, you know, a river runs through it or something like that. You have to have a diverse population, I think. You have to have some, you know, I'm not a big fan. I don't mind going to Las Vegas on business travel, but I don't choose to go there typically. I love herbs and rye, you know, but I love a city with folklore and soul. You know, New Orleans has soul to me. Buildings that, you know, I would love to stand in the ballroom at the Sands where Frank and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. performed. That was torn down many years ago. So I think for a city to be interesting and support a cocktail culture or a food culture, you know, I went to law school in New Orleans, so that's where I got the first taste of a city with a food and drink, you know, culture and folklore. I think you just have to have the city has to have an interesting history and demographics and things like that to sustain it. But
Yeah,
that's-
you've got to
Milwaukee.
have the culture before you can have a food culture and a drinks
Yeah.
culture. You've
Yeah.
got to have something, some kind of sense going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you didn't mention Atlanta, LA, Minneapolis in the previous question about what other cities.
I think LA would be a fascinating story.
Yeah.
It would be very much its own kind of story, but that would be a
Right.
fascinating story.
Both the Hollywood side and also the Raymond Chandler, you know, the old
Yeah.
Los Angeles of Phillip Marlowe, and absolutely.
And obviously, Robert, you're going to do Milwaukee at some point, right? I mean, the drinking culture in Milwaukee is so cool.
The beer that made Milwaukee famous.
Yeah.
Holy crap, everybody. We made it to the end of these. We're going to call it a win. All right, thank you so much. One last call for the bookstore, for the writers, for us, for everything, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.